Today, we are going to actually grapple with something very specific, and that is the power crisis on the African continent. It's a huge issue in our lives, right? I think if you Google, you will see that anywhere between 700 to 1 billion people out of a 1.3 billion people population don't have electricity, right? And I don't need to tell you that if you don't have energy, you don't have industrialization. And if you don't have industrialization, you don't have jobs. And if you don't have jobs, you don't have development. And we can carry on, right? So for us on the continent, people who work in the African continent, this is an existential crisis. This is a crisis that if this was a war, would have been dealt with on a war footing. That's how huge the challenge is. And what confounds us, what confuses us, what frustrates us, is that on one side you have the demand, right? 1 billion people waiting to be powered up. That's demand, right? And the other side, you have the world's largest amount of renewable resources waiting to be tapped. So if you just want to go into the climate agenda thesis itself, Africa has those resources. Then you have gas. I think by last count, Africa has enough gas to produce 60 gigawatts of power and counting, right? So it's not that we don't have the resources to generate power. We also have coal, which unfortunately has become a 4-letter word, right? It always was a 4-letter word, but it's become a 4-letter word. We also have oil, as we know. So, ladies and gentlemen, tonight, I'm actually very thrilled that I managed to put together 5 people who collectively, in my view at least, since I put them together, so you got to concede it, in my view at least, these 5 people together bring potentially all the various perspectives around this conundrum called the power challenge on the African continent. We have project developers here, we have financiers here, we have promoters here, we have government people here, and most importantly, we have passionate people here. People who believe that this problem can be solved. Quickly, in terms of introducing everybody, on my left is Kola Karim. Kola is one of Africa's biggest success stories. He's a son of the soil. Any of you who are in the wealth management industry, I advise you to meet him after the panel discussion. So that's Kola for you, and Kola will regale us, I can assure you, with his war stories on what it took for him to get where he is. Okay? Then we have George Shenouda. George works for this company called Masdar. You guys might know about it. He's head of strategy, and he will tell us what the whole UAE perspective on power and renewables is. Hanan is actually, one of the hats she wears is she's the overall coordinator and in charge of private sector mobilization for COP28. So it'll be interesting to hear her. And then we have Ashish. Ashish works for a power company out of Egypt originally, but now it's Pan-African, called Infinity Power. And he will tell us a bit about the technology challenges and equipment-related challenges that we have on the continent. And then on the far left, we have Amadou Wadda. Amadou is a colleague of mine, but Amadou actually is one of Africa's veteran. He started when he was obviously very young, that's why I can still call him a veteran. But he is one of Africa's veteran project development specialists. And when he tells you what it takes to bring projects to bankability, you will respect what Amadou has achieved over the years. Okay? So, Hanan, I want to come to you because it's good manners to start with the lady in any case, but more importantly because the African challenge around the power crisis, the African challenge around the funding constraints, in many ways confuse us, as I said. And it confuses us because you have issues like risk perception, You have issues like political disturbances, but you also have issues like the climate agenda, which very often creates a narrative that is against Africa's ability to develop its own resources, which is gas primarily. So let me come to Hanan in a role as the coordinator for private sector engagement for COP28. Can you give us a quick perspective on how the UAE, which as we know is a fossil fuel economy, as we know it's an important global south economy, and as we know has been leading the narrative on issues of transition and how the power solution globally has to be pragmatically looked at. So given all that, Hanan, tell us the perspective from COP28 and how we're going to deal with the global narrative around energy transition.
Thank you so much, Sanjeev. Masdar al-khair and good evening, everyone. And thank you for coming tonight. Actually, I have worked on COP27. I'm very honored as well. And that was an African COP. And we had a lot of narrative across Africa. And I have personally launched the Africa Carbon Market Initiative when I was part of the High-Level Climate Champions, which is the UNFCCC non-state actors arm. So I would say proudly that Africa has a lot of opportunities, not to mention as well all of these things around climate, having that Africa is as well, their emissions is around 3% from the total global emissions. So it's not really a mitigation narrative over there, and all of the Africans in the room knows about that. It's about adaptation, resilience, and about investment in Africa as well. Investment, not lending to Africa. And this is as well at the heart of the COP28. So the narrative hasn't been forgotten, and having that the host country is the UAE. Again, it's a global south to global south conversation. It's bridging as well whatever has been discussed at COP27 that's not lost in the cracks. So the loss and damage, the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda, all of these conversations that resonates with the African crises and opportunities and solution is part as well of the COP28 presidency agenda and has been taken forward and has been taken care of.
An African perspective, that's actually brilliant to hear, that we have a major global south power which has its own transition challenges to deal with, taking the leadership and bringing Africa into the narrative and into the conversation. That's actually huge from an African point of view. I'll move to George Shenouda in his capacity as head of strategy for Masdar. George, why don't you pick up from where Hanan left and throw in some light on Masdar's engagement on the African continent and how it fits into the overall narrative of the UAE?
Sure. First of all, tough act to follow. Thanks, Hanan. The Africa component is very important, as Hanan said, on the COP28 agenda and previously on COP27. The UAE has acknowledged that a long time ago, so it's not a new story. The UAE has been focused on investing in Africa for decades now. If I can speak personally through Masdar's experience, we've been delivering projects on the continent for a good part of a decade. Masdar was incepted in 2006, so almost 17 years ago, and immediately as renewable energy solutions became viable, we started deploying those across Africa. So I can say that to date, we've probably invested or committed to invest close to $2 billion across 2 gigawatts of capacity directly and through our subsidiaries, including Infinity Power, and Ashish can talk a bit more about that. But Africa has always been on the radar and on the agenda of the UAE. Just recently, in the Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi that happened in September, the UAE COP28 presidency announced a UAE-led financing initiative for Africa, which is committing $4.5 billion as a starting point to help accelerate and deploy renewable energy across the continent. Masdar specifically has committed to deploying 10 gigawatts of renewable energy in the continent by 2030. To do that, we will deploy our own equity, close to $2 billion. This is our commitment, and we will look to mobilize an additional $8 to $9 billion in financing.
So Amadou, how do you develop and bring projects to bankability so that investors queue up?
Thanks, Sanjeev. Just as a reminder, I think we all know that Africa is not one country, but comprises 54 countries. And the regulatory environment differs from country to country, from region to region. So I'll answer the question with few examples at the extreme end. We did a project in Republic of Côte d'Ivoire. It was a bridge project. It took us 12 years to develop that project. What happened? You start, you're almost reaching financial close. There was a military coup, so we have to stop. Things settled down. Under IFC performance standards, you have to redo the whole environmental impact assessment again. You have to compensate people again, blah, 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 blah. You go through that process just before financial close, elections happen, the president that lost decided not to leave office, another crisis. 2 years later, we proceeded. Now, project implemented, asset is under operation. So that's one extreme. You have another case of a project we did in Djibouti, a wind farm, a country that has never done any IPP. So you have to handhold the government with regard to negotiating some of this documentation. They are used to contracting directly with EPCs. So you come with this different model of an IPP, whereby now you interact with the contractor, and all they do is buy power from your end. It took us about 4 years end to end to complete. That's another case. A third case, a project that is under construction right now in Senegal. Development time, 18 months. Why? Because Senegal decided to adopt tried and tested templates. They did IPPs before. Other than starting a new project from a clean slate, they decided to use the bankable project documents that were used to close, the previous IPPs, and brought it to this new IPP. Within 18 months, you're able to reach financial close and start construction. So that's the story of Africa. You can have 54 countries, different regimes, but the key message I want to give, in spite of all those challenges that I mentioned, all these projects have reached financial close. 2 of them have been commissioned. The other one is 60% complete.
Africa must have its own capacity to develop and de-risk projects so that global capital can come in. And that's the role Amadou's company plays, where they systematically go and see how can we develop and de-risk those so that capital follows, right? Now that allows me to bring one of Africa's most successful sons into the conversation. And Kola, you've heard all this, but you are a businessman, you're an entrepreneur, and you have done the hard miles. So tell us, or share with the audience, some of your war stories, and what do you see, or what do you want things to change as? Where do you want change to be?
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thanks, Sanjeev, for setting this up. It's important getting a better perspective, just having listened to what my fellow panelists have said, but taking on from where Mr. Wadda put it. We've listened to the opportunities that Africa has. We realize, as we know, as lovers of Africa, because I'm sure that's why we're here, we see the population of Africa is just jumping out at us, right? 65% of this continent is under the age of 30. That's beautiful, right? Because you've got 30, 40 years span of ability to trade with people. But we started from a narrative, from a standpoint, this is seen as a dark continent, because if you talk about electricity penetration, it's not there. if you think about all the major economies in the world, if you look at their growth trajectory, what do you see? Infrastructure, power, roads, everything that eases doing business. But if you transpose that to the continent of Africa, that's what's missing. But the turn of the whole event is this is the glaring opportunity of the continent. But there are factual, obvious problems. But let's start with unpicking that. First is leadership. One major shift has happened on the continent of Africa the last 20 years. Bar the last 3 years, is we've seen steady, democratic type structures on the continent. That compared to the 80s, the 70s, we're seeing a departure. What's happened recently is recent, but I'm sure we'll get past that. The second part is there are now financial institutions of note growing up from the continent of Africa. So you have the African Finance Corporation, you have the Afri-Exim Bank, you have other multilateral institutions who are focused on Africa's development by trying to size up and support those opportunities to grow. The last part of it, we now see African entrepreneurship who understands the dynamics of working in Africa, who understands the ways businesses are done on the continent and the level of engagement of how businesses are done on the continent. Then we seize these opportunities to grow. I'll give you a typical example. Today we're working on a $2 billion rail project, and this rail project is a driver from the African Free Trade Agreement that African countries need to trade together, work together. But how do you do this if you cannot even connect each other? So this rail service was designed to come from the port of Lagos to link Maradi in Niger Republic. Uranium, you've got a lot of soda and stuff that's exported from there. But today, I'll give you a dynamic. Most of the uranium from Niger is transported by road. That's why you've got a lot of military presence in Niger Republic and escorted to Cotonou in Benin Republic. It takes 7 days. By completing this rail line, it takes 16 hours from Maradi to the port of Lagos. Just think about the safety and what that would energize across that corridor. On this project, $2 billion, we engaged African Finance Corporation because we realized by engaging international financial institutions, they do not understand the dynamics of the continent. African Finance Corporation, an African-led, Africa-focused financial institution who is a development institution focused on development of Africa. They came on board and they brought along other international financiers. Today, that project is done 120 kilometers from Kano out of 467, and we started last year. That is effective coordination. One, start with leadership who understands the determination and the will. We want to get this done. You have a promoter who has got the understanding and know-how to get it done. But more importantly, you have the financial institution who's got the understanding on how to put this together and making a success out of it. Go back 15 years before now. We were talking of developing power plants in Nigeria. First, let me go back to the financing. 25 years ago, when you look at a country like Nigeria, the financial institutions in country, and most of West Africa, are not strong enough with their balance sheet that to finance a $200 million project, you need the club together of about 10, 15 banks. Today, you have financial institutions in West Africa, in Africa, that has single obligor limits of 350, north of 350 to 500 million. So it tells you African financial institutions have come of age, they can write checks, they just need the right hand holding partners like African Finance Corporation and people that understand the continent to hold hands to get this done. So this just gives you a nutshell of what the snapshot of the opportunities that could be built from this continent. 15, 20 years ago, when we were working on a 20 megawatt power plant, we were talking to African Development Bank, the IFC. The first thing they asked us for, we need EIA. They stopped and delayed this project because there were birds. Now, I have no problems against birds, but Africans are people. But project was delayed that will generate power and drive income in society of people. Because some guy sitting in Washington, his closest visit to the continent of Africa is via Google Earth. Now, we need to shift the dynamics of how we accept and evaluate doing business on the continent.
But I think you underlined a very important point, and that is that today on the continent, not only do you have institutions which are able to and prepared to take early stage project development risk, but also you have domestic African capital that is actually taking that risk. How can we use technology to create that exponential leap for Africa? We saw that with mobile phone technology, what it did to Africa. And we believe that even the power solution has to come through technological leaps, not through vanilla solutions. So Ashish, in your capacity as the Chief Technical Officer of Infinity Power, just share your thoughts on where technology is going and how is Africa placed.
I'll take one example just to give the perspective of how things are really changing in the African continent when it comes to the technology landscape. So for instance, Egypt is a case in point because they had been the first mover when it comes to renewable deployment. And for instance, they were the first one who started the wind power projects as early as 22 to 25 years before. But those times, the wind turbine sizes were, hardly anything compared to what we compare in the present scheme of things. Now just compare just 3 to 4 years back, the wind power projects which were executed in Egypt had a hardly, a rotor diameter of 60 meters or 50 meters, which could generate at per unit basis 2 to 3 megawatt. In just few years of time, we are executing and erecting wind turbines which are 7 megawatt each unit, which are having a rotor diameter of 80 meters. Just imagine how the technology landscape has changed. So the point I want to emphasize that Africa, the whole narrative is always that Africa has all the challenges, how exactly you could deploy that technology in the given time frame with all the other challenges, but we have a success in consideration. Now, something similar narrative is also happening in solar space as well. For instance, right now, the whole market is changing so fast that it's very difficult to gauge where exactly the landing price for modules could be in coming 1 month, given what is happening in the present scheme of things. So slowly it is becoming more of a pricing game. So where exactly the technology retains its narrative. So that's where there's an emphasis and strong focus on the solar side as well, that in Africa, there's a good emphasis to do the localization when it comes to the supply chain and also the high value technology solutions. So for instance, the glasses which are used in the solar modules, they are very difficult to transport, and given the whole supply chain is coming all the way from China. So there is a good ecosystem which could be created wherein Africa as such could be the hub for these glasses which are used in the solar modules, and it is already happening. So these are the steps which are happening already in the technology landscape, but given the gravity of the problem, like in whole of Africa, we are hardly talking about 50 to 60 gigawatt of installed capacity, while the potential itself is more than 10 terawatts for solar itself. So if we comprehend the level of differences in the capacity, what it could be and where it is, there's a huge scale that technology has to leapfrog.
Nobody is denying the climate challenge and the impact in terms of livelihoods and humanity as a whole. But there has to be a certain nuance to it, given that Africa's priority around development has to be balanced with Africa's ability to meet some of the climate-related targets. So George, maybe I can come to you now because, for example, Hanan, if you look at any energy mix in the world 50 years later, you will still see oil and gas playing a big role in it, right? Nobody's talking of gross zero. Everybody's talking net zero, which means there's a plus and a minus, right? And this is often lost when we talk about Africa, where somehow Africa has to be gross zero and net zero, when it's probably already net negative, right? So, George, just provoke the audience to think about what sort of energy mix should Africa look for, and what is fair for Africa's development.
Sure. I think that's a very easy answer, because if you look now at the composition of the Africa energy mix, renewables ex hydro still is a very small component. So for us to get to the issue where renewable integration or renewable part of the energy mix becomes a problem is still very far away. So as far as energy mix is concerned, definitely I think conventional power sources will still have a role to play. There is a role, obviously, for decarbonizing hard-to-abate sectors, which green hydrogen, Ashish mentioned, can play a role in. The UAE is a prime example, right? They are doubling down on renewable deployment, but they're still not shying away from investments in oil and gas, right? Because they acknowledge that in the long term, there needs to be a balance. Net zero doesn't mean you have to be zero conventional, right? It has to mean that net, you are balancing out. So it will remain part of the energy mix as conventional power. I think the rise of technologies such as battery storage will help the case of renewables down the line in terms of integration once you start hitting those technical thresholds that would cause you issues on the grid and so on.
What you think or what your views are on gas as a transition solution. We cannot move away from gas on the African continent if you're going to solve Africa's power problem, right?
Absolutely. So Africa is endowed with about 7.5% of the world's gas resources. And these reserves, we believe it can generate twice the installed capacity on the continent right now. I think Sanjeev set the stage with the level of lack of access to energy on the continent, of almost 50%. We all know that the continent's contribution towards greenhouse gas emissions is less than 4%. So we are not the problem. But what is our problem? Our problem is we need to industrialize. We don't have industries to create employment. And we are sitting on significant amount of gas reserves. It is imperative that the transition to net zero, that the journey that the whole world has signed up to, Africa needs to be given the space to industrialize, because even if we are to utilize that level of gas, the effects in terms of net emissions would be quite minimal compared to what's happening on the other side. So it is imperative that the transition, even though the long-term goal should be renewable, but given the stage of development where the continent is, there's an imperative that gas has to be the transition fuel until we can scale up the level of renewable energy. The European Commission has, which is a very, very positive move, have classified gas as a source of green energy, which is good. So it can.
This was February 2022. Right?
2022. Finally, yes. But whilst that conversation was going on, because I was in South Africa last year, I think it was when the Ukraine-Russia was basically heating up, and I think they were squeezing the supply of gas to Europe. Significant amount of coal. There was a big jump in exportation of coal to Western Europe. Why? Because of insecurity of energy, because of the closing of the gas. South Africa is sitting on tons and tons of coal. They have promised 100 billion to not use the coal, but to try and develop using renewable energy sources. But when there is a threat of energy security, the same coal that is being told to South Africa not to utilize is now being exported, up north for production. So I think there's a conscious effort right now by African leaders. We were in New York 2 weeks ago, And the Kenyan president, the president of Senegal, the president of DRC, they're all speaking from the same hymn book. And we take a lot of pleasure because AFC, to the run-up to COP27, issued a white paper where it tried to rally support around African leadership to speak with one voice regarding what is the pragmatic solution towards attainment of net zero from an African perspective. So I see all these leaders now speaking the same hymn book. I had Ashish mention localization, and that is the narrative that African leaders are championing right now. Localization in the sense that most of the transition metals are located in Africa. But what has been happening, they've been mined and shipped in their raw form to Asia, mostly in China, for production of solar panels, cells and batteries for use in electric cars, etc. There's no reason why that cannot be done in the continent. So African leaders are now saying we should adopt the concept of having circular economies within our continent. The mine that is produced needs to be beneficiated within the continent, and in so doing, you would even have significant reduction in the level of CO2 emissions, because with the large volumes of raw ore being shipped to China, can you imagine the amount of pollution out of the shipping? Because I think there was a study that showed that the shipping business alone, if it were a country, would be the sixth highest polluter in the world. So you can significantly reduce the frequency of ship travel by localizing the manufacturing or the processing of some of these mine products within the continent. That's one. But the other aspect, I think Kola mentioned the youthful population within the continent. And we believe that's a good way of creating employment for African youths, but also utilizing the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement to be able to even the manufactured goods to be marketed within the continent, within this free trade zone. So that's the narrative that Africa is putting out there. And I think the key message from African leaders now is we're not looking for aid, we are looking for investment. Come to Africa as a partner. This is where the opportunities are. But when you invest in Africa, you are also helping to reduce the emissions, because with the production of those battery minerals into cells, into batteries, they can be used as electric cars for most of the developed worlds to try and to decarbonize their countries. So I'll stop there, Sanjeev.
No, so thanks, Amadou. So, just to sort of buttress the point, there was a recent IMF study which actually said, and I'll read out, that subsidies for coal, oil, and natural gas in 2022 alone was equivalent to 8% of global GDP. And it was more than what government spent then on education, and 2/3 of what was spent on healthcare. So it just gives you a perspective that as much as the climate agenda is real, as much as the priorities are huge, there is a nuanced approach to it because of the realities on the ground. And to that extent, Africa cannot be chucked out, if I may use that term, from that conversation on the need to nuance it, right? So maybe that allows me to bring Kola into the conversation as a person who invests in oil and gas, and what does it all mean for him? Because these are threats to your general strategy and fundraising challenges, aren't they?
Sanjeev, look, the biggest issue, 2019, when this global pronunciation about net zero became forceful, 2018, 2019, and global financial institutions decided they were no longer funding oil and gas investments, the problem started. If you just look at the basic dynamics of how oil and gas works, a natural decline curve of a producing well is between 5 to 10% a year. So global consumption is 100 million barrels a day. So think about it. If 4 years, global financial institutions decided to stop funding, that's on average, if we take a 5%, that's a 20% cutback on production. So if you think about it, you've got a short gap of 20 million barrels to fill. And this is where I'm trying to explain where we got to a price of oil today and where it's going. It's up. If you've got the shorts, who are the people that you can call on to fill the gap? Saudi Arabia, the Middle East, UAE. But they've ramped up. So we still got today 7 to 8 million barrels shorts. Then Russia, Ukraine happened. That's another cutback. That gap is there. So global oil prices, you like it or not, in the next 2 to 3 years before we catch up, will still give that void and prices will be on high. Fact. But sitting where I sit, and this is where African leadership, I go back to leadership, Africa's sitting on its natural resources. African leaders need to now be emphatic about the decision-making process of where they want their countries to be. Because we have the natural resources. I'll take Nigeria as an example. You've got the Western nations running on their fourth industrial revolution. Yet, in Africa, you're trying to benchmark me on the same norms. I've not even been my first. How fair could that be? How just could that be? But again, that throws up the opportunity. And this is what it is. So as an oil producer today, we need to mobilize local, glocal is what we call it now, global and local capital, to focus in driving up a production of oil and gas and other natural resources. Beneficiation on the continent, so to enhance the job in the circular economy on the continent. Again, another opportunity. In creating those jobs that's needed to satisfy those youths on the continent, to keep growing the economies in-house on the continent, to keep it. Look, we go to conferences last week in New York, and a conference talking about job creation and immigration. There's a correlation. Think about it. When there's instability in any region, people leave fear. So if there's insecurity on the continent of Africa and there's hunger, there is no jobs, then people, the youth wants to leave. They want to migrate to Europe. So I'm telling them the only way you can stop that youthful migration towards Europe is let's create prosperity on the continent. Because if we have the prosperity on the continent, the focus is people will want to stay there and be prosperous there. Mobile telephony is shown with focused dedication. Africans, look, I started work in London in 1989. It was the yuppie era. We had something called a mobile phone. It was the size of a suitcase. It was so good, you're sitting on the tube, you're praying, someone call me, so people would look. But you know the beauty of it? Fast forward when Africa started using mobile telephony, 1999. We used the same mobile equipment the same day as New York, London, Sydney. That tells you something. But that's the opportunity. So if you look at, for me, as an oil and gas producer, Nigeria sits on 210 TCF of gas, natural gas. Just think about that. Nigeria could be an alternate supplier to Europe.
Correct.
It's there. But you know what? We shut it in because we're not providers of US dollars to develop it. Don't get me wrong, government has a lot of blame. But reality is the natural resources sit there. For 25 years, I've been to conferences globally. We're talking about the Grand Inga. What's happened to it today? Zero.
World's problems, be it food security, be it energy security, be it the need to reduce global shipping as a source of pollution, be it access to critical minerals for batteries, the solution lies in Africa. So So it is not about Africa that needs help. I think the world needs help, and Africa is the solution. And our leadership has to be able to point that out. Maybe, it's a good time to bring you in, Ashish, because you did want to share your knowledge on what's happening on the green hydrogen side, which is actually huge.
This is a new fad wherein every second country is coming up with a green hydrogen policy, right? But the fact is, how many of these projects which has been globally announced have actually seen the financial closure? Less than 2%. That's a hard fact. Why is it so? Of course, it's a combination of multiple aspects. It's too early and the market is still going through its learning curve, to really find the sweet spot. And then probably things will start shaping up on the green hydrogen space. But coming in the African context, now, again, in green hydrogen, we have replaced the electrons with molecules, right? That's what, from energy to green hydrogen, that's what the shift is. But in the whole green hydrogen landscape, the electrons are still the most relevant and most important element to make the least cost of hydrogen feasible, or to make the least cost of ammonia or least cost of methanol, whatever that you want to define the matrix. The electrons are very essential because they contribute 50% of the whole capex of green hydrogen. So you could do whatever with the electrolyzers, period, but you have to be most optimum on the renewable space, which is solar and wind. Basically, that's the renewable space that green hydrogen deals with. If you see the African context, now, there are very few countries across the world which are super rich on solar resources and super rich on the wind resources. Be it the case of Morocco, Egypt, Mauritania, all these countries are super rich when it comes to the solar and wind resource potential. But of course, they have their own challenges, which the whole ecosystem is trying to address. But just the ambit of the level of MOUs and the level of project that has been announced in recent history, I think I could put my bet on green hydrogen for sure, because again, that's the future is converging towards, and Africa will have a very important role to play because the resources are right there in Africa. With the hydrocarbons, of course, this is the same play which was being played with Middle East being the resource rich when it comes to the hydrocarbons. Something similar narrative is being at play as well on the green hydrogen, but now it's being replaced with the renewable resources, so be it solar and wind, and that's where Africa has a significant role to play.
How are you planning to deal with the politics? Because no matter what we're going to do, the stronghold you're going to face are politics and politicians.
Africa is abundant in assets. What we need is innovation, economic innovation solutions that can unlock it. Are you aware of anything being done in that regard? I know that Dr. Sultan is made a high priority. He says finance is not going to come from traditional finance. I don't know what they're doing and what's coming out, but he's highlighted it as one of the 4 pillars, and he said we need to find alternative solutions. So Hanan, what is being done?
Is there a growing maturity, a more established framework in the countries you guys operate in to catch when things go wrong? By that I mean projects like your bridge, if there's a dispute, something doesn't happen, how do we kind of improve the process when business doesn't go to plan, to try and improve investments, whether that investment is sourced locally or sourced globally?
I want to understand if there's a shift in the perception of rating agencies, right? Because, and maybe this is a question for Mr. Wadda, because if we go back to the 2008 financial crisis, it was primarily caused by these rating agencies. But even today, we tend to value and tend to look at these rating agencies for guidance with respect to the sovereign credit rating and the sovereign ability of African states to repay any foreign debt. Now, if we look at a recent case, what happened in Nigeria when they were downgraded, a lot of the Nigerian banks were in a very difficult situation because they have covenants with states that if Nigeria is downgraded, foreign financial institutions have the ability to call on that debt. And suddenly you have a state that was doing very well put in a very difficult situation, and everyone's scrambling to get, capacity on Nigerian banks and Nigerian institutions.
So you're talking about the inherent prejudice of the rating agencies. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, and then what?
Because I have a lot to say on that. Yeah.
So what I'm trying to ask is, what is, institutions like the African Finance Corporation doing to combat that?
Right.
Maybe.
Great. I'll ask Kola to take the political question because Kola is well educated and well equipped to handle such questions.
Thank you. Look, on the political side, this is what we see and we come across on the continent. The problem is you and me. You see, we, the educated and enlightened class on the continent of Africa, must now take a serious look at participating by way of either sponsorship. It could be from the local government level. How many people have you and I sponsored who we know could do it better? And that's where you get good leadership from. It's never manufactured. If you look at the Western nations, no style of democracy is proper, but there's a structure. And that structure, you do not see a guy overnight who becomes president. There is a route map to this. How many of us participating or how many of us sponsoring and supporting people to participate? That is the only way you get good governance around anticipated growth and security in any society.
Amadou, I want you to take the question on risk mitigation and how we manage risk, because we know risk will come up, right? Or problems will come up.
Absolutely. So I gave those 3 examples to show you the entire spectrum of project development. And I think in all those cases, I also showed that the projects were ultimately developed and are operating. I was part of a OECD working group. We tried to look at, basically it was a comparative study, developing projects in Africa, the US, Western Europe, and in China. And they tried to understand why it takes so long to develop projects on the continent. And we showed part of the study, we had to showcase some of our projects that we've developed and our experiences. And I think there are some very significant recommendations. The last example I gave, which is in Senegal, is benefited from the outcome of that study. So how is risk being mitigated, or how are projects being accelerated to attain financial close? Standardization of documentation is key. I'm sure there are some lawyers here, so just excuse me for this. But they can negotiate a PPA for a year and a half. They can spend a month on one clause. The force majeure alone, they can just spend a whole month just negotiating that. And at the end of the day, they reach a landing. The same landing that they've reached on the previous project, it can be used, you can work off from there for your next project, other than starting from a clean slate and negotiating again, saying the same things for a year and coming to the same landing. So that was one. The other issue is around being innovative in the financing product. And that is what we did in Djibouti. We know that traditionally lenders take significant amount of time with their DDs, credit approval processes, blah, 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 blah. So we decided to do an all equity financing model just to get the construction started. And allow the lenders, they can take their time, finish, tick all their boxes, and whenever they're ready, they come and refinance the equity. And in so doing, we're able to start the construction a year ahead of schedule. So we were like almost 60% complete when the lenders start coming and say, okay, now we're there, let's talk. So it's, for me, the best way to manage risk is to see how you can accelerate the development process, because the lengthier the process, the riskier it is. So it's more around being innovative in how you shorten the development timeline.
Yeah, and having a long-term perspective helps. Certainly in AFC, what we like to remind ourselves is Africa is not an asset allocation game for us. It's the only game we have in town, right? Mm-hmm. So therefore, when we see projects, we know that any project will have to go through 6, 7 political regimes maybe. There will be so much exogenous factors that will affect it. So we need to be resilient and we need to have a long-term perspective. And that's usually the one solution that works when problems do happen, right? And George, you wanted to add something to this conversation, right?
So it addresses two questions. One about the impact of credit rating agencies and the risk assessment of certain places, and also the other one about the real assets on the ground in Africa and how these can be used to value the money or create the money, right? So there are innovative commercial solutions that are popping up that help us add megawatts on the ground. So if you're operating in a difficult jurisdiction, credit rating is not great, potentially lenders are not willing to come in following the conventional project finance routes or whatever, you can go directly to consumer. You can go to a big mining company that has proven reserves, that has real assets, that have very clear value on international markets, and provide the energy directly to those. So that addresses both parts, right? The sovereign credit issue that, as Sanjeev was saying, has a certain predetermined picture when it comes to the credit agencies, but also helping Africa benefit from the natural resources that it's endowed with. And we're seeing more financial institutions becoming comfortable with these kinds of commercial structures. We're seeing more commercial structures that exploit or benefit from the interconnectivity of certain African markets where you have very positive regulatory framework in one place, but energy requirement in another. So you build there and transport through the exporting of interconnected grids. So all these innovative solutions are popping up and becoming more popular. And smart capital always finds a way to be deployed, right? If there is real interest from investors, such as Masdar and others, to invest in Africa, they will find a way to get the dollars deployed.
Yeah. And you know, it also helps if we can communicate better, because the African narrative, unfortunately, is not communicated well from an African perspective. So just so that you know, the project default rates on the African continent is actually the second lowest globally. I don't know how many people know that. This is not me saying it. That's the World Bank saying it. That doesn't mean there is no risk. It means that projects do get therefore structured well, right? So somehow the risk rating agencies' perception or the pressures they face has to be mitigated by communication from our side as well, right? So there is that thing that we need to work on. It's in our control. Hanan, over to you for your final comments. Words of wisdom, words of encouragement.
No, I think we're hearing a lot of wisdom and encouragement. I don't want to sound cliche, but I want to say that we don't have a lot of engagement at COP28 from African businesses, and we're really looking forward to engage with you and see you there. And I said that back in London in May at the Invest Africa event as well. We're really looking for engagement with the African business. Come to us, discuss with us how you want to get engaged. We have a lot of initiatives and projects, and not particularly that you have to be presented at COP28, but be engaged with us as well. So keep an eye on the COP28 website. Happy as well to receive any questions, if you like, from a private sector. And yeah, we're looking forward to continue this. So this is not an African COP, but still it's an African COP at heart. So we have to make sure of that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. George?
I will just echo the comments made by my fellow panelists and say that it's very evident there is no global energy solution that does not include Africa. Africa has a big role to play from resources, from energy, green hydrogen, all of that. So think of Africa as an investment destination. Try to see through the smog and the smoke. I think as far as Masdar is concerned, Africa is a big part of our growth strategy. We really see the opportunity there. And we invite other important stakeholders in the discussion to also view Africa in a different lens, maybe try to adapt the capital that is allocated to be deployed in a certain way that fits the needs of Africa. It's not a cookie cutter approach that we're seeing globally. Africa needs its own tailored approach. And as you say, you create the opportunity, the people stay. It's a self-fulfilling cycle, right?
Thank you, George. That's great. Amadou?
There's a misconception with regard to availability of bankable projects for investment. I think AFC has shown that there are bankable projects on the continent, and that we do develop projects and make them bankable for investors. So we have a huge pipeline, and we have a increasing number of developers that are on the continent developing projects, structuring them so that investors will be comfortable to come and invest. So the old notion of there being a paucity of bankable projects on the continent does not hold any longer, and that there are a number of African developers, particularly AFC, that has a huge pipeline of projects that it is willing to share with investors that have interest on the continent.
And mobilizing domestic capital, right,
absolutely,
to de-risk projects.
Sure.
Kola?
Africa's opportunities can only be talked about like we have done, but the narrative as spoken could only be echoed by you who attended this, because the opportunities that sit on the continent is known, the dynamics of what works on this continent is known, the reality of the natural resource base of this continent is also known. So most of what we're echoing is not alien, but yet what's missing is the echo chamber that you all represent. And that's the dynamics that will make a difference on this continent, because those yearning young people on this continent are not going to take no for an answer. And that affects all of us. In time, if we do nothing, the do nothing approach will never work, because this is an enlightened community of people, because mobile telephony has changed the dynamics of how the world works. So if we all walk away thinking, that is not my problem, it is. And so these opportunities for us to all build, work together to make happen in a sensible, realistic way that will benefit all, because Africa's time is now. Thank you.
Well said. I mean, there's a saying, right? I think somebody said it, that they tried to bury us, but they forgot we were seeds. And I think that is the essence of what the African story is. Ashish, you get the last word.
Yeah, so always the difficult.
Technologically speaking.
Always the difficult. So I think all the fellow panelists have already touched upon, I do not have to repeat, Africa is the center of, the world when it comes to the energy landscape, and it will get its, space in the future. Now, I'll give one example of my own company in terms of what trust and faith we have in Africa. Now, since 2020, when this joint venture platform between Infinity Energy, which is an Egyptian IPP, and Masdar was formulated, we are in 2023 and we already have scaled from 300 megawatt solar, portfolio to a 1.3 gigawatt. And organic route or inorganic route, we believe in this continent and we are really proving it ourselves. And we are not just stopping here. We have, really, thought for why to stop. There is only sky's the future in Africa. So we set a very ambitious target of being a 10 gigawatt company by 2030, which means we have to scale close to 10 times compared to where we are. Now, when we discuss with various stakeholders in the industry, they do come with their own skepticism and certain, of course, reservations given it's Africa. It takes time. Of course, it takes time. But again, you have to be there to really, find a way how exactly to turn it around. And that's where we coming into picture, and with the support of shareholders like Masdar. And we will be there in all likelihood. So that's how I like to close my statement.
Thank you, Ashish. That's powerful stuff. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.